Hello, Melissa.
Hi, Pete. I just took a big drink of coffee
I
just as
timed
we're
it.
about to start.
I
So
timed
I'll
it.
be,
I was very
yeah, you
intentional
did.
to
Good
catch
timing.
you when you were mid swig of coffee.
Yeah.
So we're going to do things a bit differently from now on. We are going to just start recording. We have a few like vague ideas maybe, and then we're going to see what happens organically. We're going to let the conversation just take its own path, because very often what happens is that we start talking about the preordained title, finish talking about it after like 15 minutes, discover something way more interesting that we want to talk about, and then feel this kind of slavery to the original title that doesn't need to be there. So how about we name this When We're Done? That's right, guys. I don't know what this episode is called yet.
No, I don't either. We're out there. We're dangling over the unknown. It's exciting. So I'll start by saying I bought a new light for my podcast setup. So that's exciting. No, the thing that I first think is like noteworthy is for those of you who listened to our last episode on the adaptability model, kind of loosely speaking about how to adapt to kind of rapidly changing circumstances in a session, preparing ourselves and kind of shoring up our ability to endure swings and not playing in a way that's more risk adverse than optimal, because we're afraid or we're resistant or we don't want to lose a big stack. The hypothetical is like you have a bunch of chips in front of you and you just, you're thinking, your mind starts switching to thinking, oh, this is going to be a winning session. This is such a great, what a great day. And then something threatens that and you play in a way that's suboptimal because you're afraid of losing what you've just gained. And the adaptability model that we kind of organically, I think, arrived at through our conversation was this idea that you have to be almost like a character in a video game that's going from level to level. And suddenly you're in a new world where the weapons that you had in the previous world are no longer useful, and you have to immediately adapt. And that the power in that model is almost limitless, because if you are able to adapt and you're not afraid and you're not overly risk adverse in those situations, then it could make you a very powerful player. So that's a recap. I will say that since that conversation happened a week ago, I have since incorporated that kind of, I think we kind of termed it the adaptability model. I incorporated that model into my live play. And I have to say that it's really helpful. And there was definitely times when it was very hard to do. And I will say, like, I've had a pretty good week, so I didn't really face any situations where I went from like, having like a 3 buy-in upswing day to like being down 5 buy-ins. And like, it wasn't like some extreme, I didn't have any extreme swings in any one session, but I did have some sessions where I was, I had a winning session and I felt this urge to like resist getting into bigger pots. I felt the urge to kind of resist putting my chips at risk, and it kicked in this sense of, no, resist that, be prepared for whatever comes next, and know that whatever comes next, you can handle it and you're going to be able to adapt to it. So whatever world happens to pop up, if that world means that you are now down 2 buy-ins instead of being up 2 buy-ins, then you'll adapt. If that world means you are up 4 buy-ins instead of being up 2 buy-ins, you'll adapt. Nothing will essentially change except the external world you're in. And I found it to be very helpful, and at times harder to do than others, but a really good kind of mental model for dealing with that kind of risk adverse impulse that we have.
Yeah, so by knowing that we're going to be okay even in one of the most extreme cases, be that good or bad, we're able to shun the desire to avoid that state of affairs at all costs, where we basically have so-called real confidence, which is based on being able to cope with the spread of realities as they're going to come at us, rather than being fine when we're in a good version of reality and then falling apart when we're in a bad one and only feeling good while we're in the good one, which is a kind of synthetic, kind of perched on a ledge ready to be blown off by the slightest gust of wind type of pseudo confidence, not real confidence. So the adaptability model was basically, just to sort of go over that again, we used the analogy of like losing a loved one or like something bad happening in life, and we talked about how humans have a few stages that they go into, but we talked about like condensing that and using the human coping mechanism, like the way we cope with tragedy and grief, to cope with losing 2 stacks in one pot. Like you could go through shock, disbelief, you could move into anger, you could move into acceptance, and then like eventually just being okay again. And if you can follow that roadmap quickly, maybe in a few minutes rather than a year or whatever it would be for a life tragedy, you can then be at the end of that journey and have adapted to the new situation. So how did you get on with like was there a time when you were like stacked or something, like when something like you lost a pot you weren't expecting to and it was like a bit painful in the moment, and like did you go through any of those states in order to try and process it quickly?
No, honestly, I didn't. Like I said, I had a pretty good week. I didn't really encounter any spots that where I lost my stack or a big pot. It was more like the other end of it, like, you know, winning like 2 or 3 or being up 2 or 3 buy-ins like early on in the session and feeling that impulse to not get involved or not to put my chips at risk. So it was more of like, I guess if we want to bring it back to like this example of like how we grieve as human beings, it was more like I have a loved one who I care deeply about and I can't imagine ever living without. So I'm going to behave in a way toward them that is, you know, overly protective or something like that. That was more what it was. That's more what I experienced. So I guess in a way I haven't really been tested. I haven't really tested it yet because I haven't really had to. So yeah, that's just honestly.
So in that analogy, like a loved one could be like the chip stack, and you could feel so attached and magnetized to like the progress of your session and that wealth accumulation, the plastic discs growing and big castles and turrets in front of you, and then feeling like, well, if that was to be wiped out, I wouldn't be able to cope. Therefore, I'm going to stay out of this pot and I'm not going to 3-bet the king jack suited like we talked about at the end of last week. And then you can say, well, part of loving is to send your loved one off into the world for adventure. Your child has to adventure, has to go to like different clubs and meet other kids and do things, right? I'm not a parent, but I'd imagine that's a big part of it. And we have to send our chip stack off to do the same thing. We have to be like, yeah, you've grown a lot, but you're only one. You're not actually a real thing. You're not actually a measurement of success. You just happen to be the weapon I'm wielding, and the bigger the gun I'm wielding, you know, the more I'm going to fire it in some situations, and the more opportunities I have to get into really high EV situations with other weak players, live, deep stacked, big SPRs. It's a real gold mine for even more EV, right? As long as you're not risk averse. So maybe we can build on what we said last week by saying, for live players who actually play 300 big blinds deep, that might be some of the most lucrative high stakes for your stakes, as it were. Maybe the game is playing like 5-10, even though it's only 2-5 kind of poker you can get into. And if you're shying away from that because you want to lock up a few organic buy-ins, like, you know, 300 big blinds, let's say, when actually the game is playing way bigger than that and being deep, the sizes are big pre, and, you know, playing with 300 organic big blinds is actually like playing with 150 big blinds effective because of the way the game is playing. Well, now you're not even deep. You've got to risk those 300 big blinds and sometimes be in giant pots where it's all at risk, just like if you were in like 100 BB 150 BB deep pot online or something. But yeah, live players, man, I played all week and I didn't get stacked. What the fuck is that? That's such a live player thing to say. It's never, no online player has ever been able to say I played this week and I didn't get stacked. I don't think I've ever had a session where I didn't get stacked. No, I have, but a week, no, forget about it.
It's funny because there's such a temptation with live play too, to, if you have, you know, if you're up 2 or 3 buy-ins or you're up 600 big blinds or something like that, you know, to just like lay back, because especially if you're not playing poker professionally and you're, you know, you have your you have your other job, which is stressful and requires like, you to be constantly engaged and constantly, you're not in a recreational state of mind when you're in your other job. The impulse and the temptation is, I'm now outside of my regular job. I'm playing poker. I have all these chips in front of me. I can kind of lay back. I can have a few drinks and I can just hang out. Maybe there's a few people at my table that I like talking to or who are funny and making jokes, and it can turn into a kind of social, like sitting at a bar with some friends, right? And it can, and even better, you're sitting at a bar with friends and you have all these chips in front of you, right? Like there's something really fun about that. I'm not going to lie. Like that's actually like a really fun thing, especially if like, you are like a little buzzed or something and you're actually enjoying your company. Like it's really fun, but that temptation is bad.
Yeah.
Like, and you have to resist it. Like you have to resist it at all costs, I think.
Yep.
For me personally, maybe there's other players out there that are much more recreational and that they look at that and they're like, this is my Friday night. Like I'm going to chill. This is good. I'm going to go home with like, having made some money tonight and had a good time. And in the morning I'll wake up and, whatever. But for me, it's not that way at all. And so I have to resist that. I've also stopped drinking at all when I play.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is something I didn't do it. Like I didn't wake up one day and I'm like, oh, I'm going to, be a kind of whatever, straight and narrow, sober player. It wasn't that way at all. It was much more just like, I realized that even if I had like one drink, I'm not somewhat like, I guess maybe I'm a bit of a lightweight or something, but even if I had one drink, I still found myself making decisions that were just weird or at the time, like not feeling, like not thinking through things. Like it triggered my, the kind of reptile brain, if you will. I felt myself being a little bit more aggressive in areas that didn't warrant it, more willing to kind of put my chips at risk, kind of the opposite. And it was just suboptimal. And it wasn't like a disaster. It wasn't like I felt like I had this huge problem. And I'm not saying I won't ever drink again, but I just, as a general matter, like I find my sessions to go much better when I just think to myself, okay, I'm just going to have a Red Bull or I'm going to, drink something that's non-alcoholic. And that's actually been like a nice thing. And it also, I think, helps me resist the temptation to turn it into a more social situation if I'm having a really good day and I have those chips in front of me.
Yeah, I think it would get really out of hand when you would like be sick on the table and like punch people in the face and stuff. And like at the time you got a pair of scissors and started cutting up the felt, that was really bad. So I'm glad that
only happened once.
I know, but it's still unacceptable. So
it was a bad beat too, and it was an OMC. So
yeah, the fact that the scissors were like old and rusty, they were like something from like a 1980s classroom or something as well. It was really weird when you did that. Like I'm really good at just making up stories that didn't actually happen.
Yeah,
guys.
No, it's good. I appreciate it. So
but let me come back on that, the drinking thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
On a serious note, so I think because you're more of a creative type, like you're definitely going to be more susceptible to everyone's inhibitions are lowered by alcohol, right? Like this is what it does. It relaxes you to a point where your normal defense mechanisms against things are slowly chipped away at and then ultimately removed when you reach like a level of blind drunk, which is why people do things that they maybe don't remember, or if they do remember, they regret, and it's like alien to them when they wake up the next day, because normally you have these inhibitions keeping you safe from that behavior. And the more creative you are as a person, the more kind of right brain, is that the right word? The more right brain you are rather than left brain.
I think so.
I think it's the right way around.
It's one or the other. Yeah.
I think I read somewhere that like that makes you a bit more susceptible to alcohol. So it's not that surprising to me that maybe your ability to justify things, to narrate, remember you used to narrate a lot, probably gets, peaked a little bit more when you have a drink or two. And yeah, like you say, it starts you on that road to, your brain's very good at contextualizing, and it's going to start to see the experience as more of like a social realm experience rather than like, this is my second job, I'm here to grind, I want to, I'm gonna be a poker player for the next 6 hours. So I think it is really bad when you fall into the trap of putting pleasure. I think it's a form of hedonism, again, to fall into the trap of putting the short-term enjoyment of the session before EV, because if you are a professional, okay, there are times when maybe you can do that a little bit and you don't want to fall into the trap of like just being the guy that stalks the fish and follows him to the bar and like puts EV first to such an extent that you end up just being a moron and acting in ways that are just like against all of your human conditioning. that's not good. But at the same time, when you're in a hand, you know, EV should always come first. We shouldn't be having these external motivating factors like, well, if I don't play this pot, I'll enjoy my night more. And it's like, okay, that's fine if you're a recreational player, but if you're someone who at times gets really passionate about poker success and pictures, you know, a career for yourself in poker, whether that, you know, one day replaces your job or becomes your job, or whether it's just a side career, it doesn't really matter. If you're putting things before EV, you have a big problem. And I can actually go on a little tangent here. I was teaching a guy this morning, brand new student, and in the first session, like, you never know what you're going to get. But what this student had, it's basically very typical of just like newer players. Like he's just come back into poker after a long hiatus, hasn't really played for a long time. And a spot came up where he had pocket nines and he'd checked out a position to a recreational player that had flatted the button, and the flop was queen jack 4 rainbow, and he checked the flop and the recreational player had bet and he had raised like to pot. And we talked about this hand and he was saying, I don't like my play just now. Looking back on this was a month ago, I hate it because like I should just bet the flop because it's better for my range, and I shouldn't make this raise because like what am I representing and blah blah blah. And this was basically how it went. And my rebuttal was like, I'm going to be frank with you, none of the things you've said, neither for the case for c-betting now, like as you look at it today, or your in-game thought process at the time, neither of them have anything to do with EV. Not even your criticism of your own play has anything to do with EV. So you have a big whack of poker players, right, who are actually showing up to their session and not thinking about any factor that's causally related to EV when they're making decisions. And that is insane. It's absolutely fucking crazy. It's like I'm imagining a golfer not trying to hit the golf ball, like swinging at something else and just hitting a tree with his club and being like, bam, the fucking tree deserved it. Yeah, I got that tree good. It's like, yeah, okay, but that's not going to help you win this golf tournament. Like, okay. So sometimes people's aims in poker have absolutely nothing to do with EV, both like in the case of like drinking and staying out of pots or whatever. Okay, that's fine because at least like there's some fun from that. But people's technical thought process sometimes is untraceable back to expected value. That there was no way of linking what they're saying to the EV of one line being better than the other. And in the maze of like modern day poker theory and like being bombarded with the problem of too much information and they're drowning in the sea of jargon, they sometimes forget that your goal at all times is to avoid performing an action that has a lower EV than some other action. That is your goal at all times. If you perform an action and its EV is lower than some other action, that's not allowed. You can't ever do that, right? If you think two lines are ambiguously close, which they often are, like, okay, do you want to bet small on the flop or do you want to check, like with top pair or second pair or whatever? Who cares? That's unlikely to be a bit. There might be an EV swing against your true opponent, but against like the global pool, it's unlikely to be a very big swing. But when you're making decisions for reasons like, oh, I have a range advantage, so I'm just going to bet my hand without thinking about what my hand is or what it gains by betting or anything, or when you say, I bet because I want to rep that king, has nothing to do with your EV. The fact you wanted to represent a card that came on the turn has nothing to do with the choice of whether betting or checking is better. Nothing. So people need to basically understand that when they're making poker life choices, like life choices within poker, like do I drink, you know, how long do I play for, when do I take breaks, blah, blah, blah. That needs to be in the vein of maximizing EV. And then when they're in a hand, let's not lose sight of the whole goal of the game, right? Because a lot of people do. And it's crazy to me, but it happens.
Well, I think, you know, remembering when I used to be one of these players who didn't think about EV and didn't, you know, kind of filter all of my decisions through that. I think the temptation is that people don't understand what is positive EV and what is negative EV. I mean, outside of like, okay, you know, they're like, okay, in my mind, if I drink, I play like terrible. And if I stay sober, I play well. Well, they're going to stay sober. They don't know that that's plus EV. They don't put it in that context, but it is in their mind. They just don't think about it that way. But I think in the course of like a session during a hand, you resort to a thought process that you're familiar with, which is the thought process that you bring from the outside world, which is you bring from negotiating the world, which is all these other factors like, okay, he just got stacked and maybe he's bluffing now, or, you know, she's been really passive. So clearly she's got, you know, she must have a hand now. And
these aren't even bad. These aren't even bad thoughts. Like what you're saying there, those are exploitative deviations that you may or may not
Okay.
add to your thought process. Like in some, like they may be justified or they may not. It depends on the situation. But they're not like, they're related to EV. The fact that someone is drunk and just got stacked is definitely traceable to the EV of your options going up and down and to the best EV line changing. Like I would say that's definitely related. Whereas a concept like, well, this card isn't so good for his range, when that's misused, that has nothing to do with EV at all. When you bet the middle of your range because a card has nothing to do, because a card isn't very good for your opponent's range, you're making a mistake because you're not looking at anything that actually shows you the factors. So I think like something like, oh, well, when you talk like this, I think you're bluffing. Like if I have that read, okay, maybe people are too presumptuous with these reads, which is probably what you're saying, but I don't think that's even so much the problem. I think it's the stuff that is like on a different logical plane. It is not even causally related at all. I think that's the stuff that people need to get the hell out of their thought process, at least until...
Would an example of that thinking be, I wanted to get him off top pair?
Yeah, so that's almost... It's not totally unrelated to EV, but what that does is it zooms too far into the picture and it kind of zooms in, puts the blinkers on, and then you don't know what's going on anymore. So if you imagine like a horse, and the horse's job is to like go and drink out of like a bucket of water. Horses are too big for bowls, Melissa, so they drink out of buckets, by the way. So the horse goes over to the bucket of water, and as it gets nearer, its blinkers like stop it seeing more and more of the world, right? And as its head is right at the water, now there's like a threat, there's like a predator like coming at the horse, but it doesn't know because it can't. Okay, this is a deaf horse, right? So it's an unrealistic example, but it doesn't see the predator coming. But if it had been further away from its target, it would have been able to still have enough of a field of vision to see that predator coming. So it's like the closer that you get to details, the less of the world you can see once you put your own blinkers on and become a horse. So when you say, I bet to try to target top pair, which I just made a video where I rambled about targeting. This makes my blood boil. Targeting makes me so angry that I want to like punch someone in the face. I absolutely hate targeting. It's the most reprehensible word in the poker world, and it's been allowed to flourish and thrive like a cancer. And that's the problem I have with it. There's a lot of bad poker thought processes, like represent the ace, but these get stomped out because the majority of people can see that they're bad. But targeting pulls the wool over people's eyes. It's a very alluring because it reduces the problem to, here's the water I drink, now I'm at the water, and it takes out the rest of the environment. So what you need to do in poker is you need to find the right level of perspective. So as you're like approaching the water to drink out of it, you still need to be able to see what's around you. You still need to be able to function. You need to know what's on the ground so you don't like fall into a ditch or whatever. You still need to have vision. So when you're on the river and you think, should I bluff here? Saying I'm going to target top pair and make that fold. The problem with that is, one, you might not be able to accurately assess how likely that is to happen. Some people just say, well, I am willing it to happen, and I've decided that top pair should fold, therefore it's going to fold, and I'm going to make it fold. That's one problem. And then the other problem is, well, what if top pair is like a very small amount of your opponent's range? Like, what if your opponent's range is mostly other stuff or largely other stuff? So the problem with this focus on targeting and on like thinking about just a small portion of the range at one time is that either it's a gross, like abominable thought process because you've ignored most of the range at the expense of just thinking about one part, or if all of villain's range or almost all of villain's range is top pair, then why are you even saying I'm targeting top pair? That's like me saying I'm targeting this mug as I pick it up. Like, yeah, okay, but the mug is the entire thing, right? Like I need to target the handle because that's the only relevant part of the mug for me picking it up like this, but you wouldn't say that because that is everything, right? So you don't need to say targeting just to say I'm playing against villain's range. So yeah, absolutely, when people play against a very small region of their opponent's range, because it's easy and because it simplifies things, that is verging towards a thought process that I wouldn't say it's completely unrelated to EV, but it's fractured at such a micro level that like it's like the poker thought process you need to have as a glass, and imagine you throw it up in the air and it shatters, and then you pick up one piece of it and you're like, this is the thought process. It's like, no, it's not. You smashed it into pieces and only chose one piece. That's the thing you're looking at. You're not looking at the whole thing anymore. The whole thing isn't there anymore for you to look at because you've gone too far in, zoomed in too much.
And if your impulse, I think the impulse of most people is to reduce it to one thing. If you're in a high stress situation, you go into, I think it's very easy to grasp onto something that's like the easiest solution, like the first lifeline that appears. It's
Yep.
like, okay, I'm going to grab that. I'm going to go out. This happened last week where I'd called in the big blind with pocket fives and flopped a set and small blind bet out. I raised and then button just jammed and small blind folds. I call and I stacked this guy who turns over pocket kings and says, and that was an overpair. And he says, oh, well, I just watched you lose the previous pot, so I figured you were just steaming in that situation.
Yep.
And, like, I'm not saying like jamming there was like necessarily like negative EV for there. I think there's maybe an argument for it, but
I want to point something out here as well, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be negative EV to be a blunder. It just has to be worse than another positive EV line. Right. So like if calling is way better than jamming, and I'm not saying it is, it depends on too many things.
Right.
Then calling can still be bad, right? Because it's not the highest EV play. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So yeah, and that's right. There was other factors involved, but the point is that his reason wasn't, well, I jammed because I thought that was the highest EV. His reason was I jammed because I just watched you get stacked, or I didn't get stacked, but I lost a big pot to him previously, and I thought you were steaming, and there was just like that was his like reason for wanting to jam there, and so I think, and I've been on the other side of this too, where it's like you just reduce the situation to one solution, and you see nothing else, and you grasp onto that solution. And I actually think that is probably one of the most dangerous temptations in poker, which has the potential to just ruin you, where if you can't recognize your impulse to do that, and you can't stop it, and you can't just take your time. I mean, you may, when you encounter that kind of situation, you may end up jamming there because you think it's the highest EV, but do it because you think it's the highest EV, not because you're, thinking, oh, well, she's tilting here, I jam.
Yeah.
Like it may be, okay, she's tilting here. That's one factor. It's also, there's a flush draw out there. Okay, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what happened.
So that's a factor that isn't totally unrelated to EV, but it's insufficient, right? It's a case of insufficient reasoning where people say X, therefore Y, when actually Y doesn't follow from X. So it's like saying, well, there was an umbrella in that guy's bag, so it must be raining. And it's like, well, yeah, the umbrella is evidence that it might be raining, or maybe it rained recently, or rain is expected, but that alone does not causally sufficient to say that it's therefore raining, right? So poker players do this all the time. They're like, well, she lost the big pot, therefore I'm going to now jam. And that doesn't actually follow, because now maybe if you're actually steaming and have a bunch of nothing in your range, surely call is best, right? Let's allow the nothing to keep going. It depends on the wetness of the board, but on Queen 5-3 or something, rainbow, why on earth would you want to jam kings against someone that you thought was like steaming random gutters and worse all the time? So that doesn't make sense. So yeah, you're right, it's very insufficient, but I think there's two things at play here. One is basically the temporary blindness that comes from feeling threatened. So when we feel that our resources are at stake, we go into tunnel vision naturally, and we grasp onto whatever thought we can that can lead us out of the situation. So we look for these sort of beacons of light, but sometimes these are false beacons of light. If I was Peterson, and if I were Peterson, I would say, the devil is actually coming for you, the siren is coming for you, or whatever, and the banshee's going to take you to hell under the guise of some kind. And I would have a biblical story all ready for it and stuff like that. But that's the idea, that these thoughts are like kind of fraudulent charlatans that come out at your time of need. If you think about psychopaths, right, like predatory people who are pathologically sort of mentally built to try and harvest stuff from others, right? If you think about those people, who do they prey upon? Like, who does a psychopath prey upon? They prey upon people that have undergone trauma, people who are just mentally damaged, people who are mentally ill, people with really low self-esteem, because those people are in a weakened state where they can be duped by the psychopath's false light, the false promise. And these thoughts are like psychopaths, like in this analogy, where they show up and they're like, hey, I can show you a way out of this dark cave that you've just found yourself in. And the answer is, she just lost a big pot, so she must be steaming. And then it's like, well, that's really convincing. It's like those scammers that phone old ladies and they're like, oh, by the way, your computer has a malicious virus and it's going to blow up unless you send money to this agency that can cure it for you remotely. And they're like, oh my God, I'm so scared about the virus that's going to make my computer explode that this feels like a really good out right now. Like that, like I'll take that right now,
Yeah.
Like when you get all
But
in
it
with a
even
gutter,
goes
you'd rather have a gutter than nothing. You'll accept that, right? If you just have some beacon of hope
right.
sometimes. Yeah.
Like the psychopaths, like just get into this van. It's
Hmm.
totally fine.
Yep.
No, I think people, we do this in so many ways. Like it's just, I think a lot of the ways that people think like politically is like this. Like they think the most obvious solution is the right
Hmm.
answer and the one that presents itself. And, you know, political commentators and politicians themselves that come and, they offer easy solutions to incredibly complex problems.
Yep.
And they say like, like, oh, well, if only we got rid of, this or that, or
Hmm.
if we stopped this, or if we outlawed that,
Yep.
then your life would be totally better and this would all go away.
Well, that's
And
Trump and that's Biden, right? And they just so happen to
yeah,
be the two most popular US candidates. The other people who are like way off the mainstream actually
mhm,
have more, from what I've heard, I'm not a US politics expert, but they seem to have more
mhm,
like coherent, bigger picture, in touch with reality answers than the
yeah,
big two have. Like if I was listening to like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who once you
uh-huh,
get over his the voice, is actually he's a bit weird. Like he goes along with a lot of conspiracy theories and things like this, but
yeah.
he actually gives a lot of a much more well-rounded answer on a lot of issues than like Trump and Biden do. So I think that's right. Like sometimes the brightest beam of light is actually the one that you can't
Oh
trust.
yeah,
I need to do my
yeah.
Kennedy impression at some point. That's a
Yeah,
classic.
the gravel voice. Yeah, I mean, anyone's going to be more coherent than two, elder people, both of whom have like applesauce for brains. But I think, yeah, so I think the bar is pretty low
Mm,
to offer like a more coherent,
I agree.
you know, but but I do think like the temptation to be tricked, right? The
Mm,
temptation to be swindled, to be, people like to think of themselves as like being like, I would never be tricked out of my resources. I would never be, convinced to do something that I haven't fully thought about it, swindled, whatever. And like it happens all the time. And I think it happens because our impulse as human beings is to avoid complexity and go towards simplicity because we
mm,
can only handle so much at one time.
mm-hmm.
And most people's lives are complicated enough, raising families, going to work, making a living, et cetera, that like when it comes to like a complex decision, like, okay, how do you feel about international trade? Do you, or like, what is your opinion on, taxes, for instance? Like people have like a general approach, like less tax is better, or I'm for free trade. But like it doesn't go beyond that. And frankly, it shouldn't. It really shouldn't. And there's kind of this idea like in an ideal society, like people wouldn't really think about politics because it would take care of itself
Mm,
and that there would be discussions and debate and democracy would function in its, in the way it does. But at the end of the day, like this obsession that people would have over like every little, what is Trump doing at every single minute?
yep.
Like that's so manufactured
Mm-hmm.
from the media and it's so manufactured from kind of this message that is shot out at us all the time. You have to worry about this. You have to be concerned about this. They're coming for your family. They're coming for your resources. They're coming for you. You're coming for you. And it's like turning all that off is so important and being able to just understand that you're being swindled, essentially. You're being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I love about poker in my life, and I think other people would probably agree, is that it is generally, for the most part, free of politics. And it's free of that kind of manipulative stream of BS that's constantly yelling at you, telling you to be afraid, telling you to, be on guard and to vote for this person or to give money to that cause. It's free from all of that. And that's a really nice place to be. And it's one of the big reasons why I think I'm so instinctively drawn to it, is that it feels, when it's going well, it feels like a bubble that's like sealed around the table and the outside world is just out there and it can't come in.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even a lot of times where I think it's considered almost like a faux pas or like socially awkward for someone to bring up politics. Like I sit at a lot of tables where if someone mentions Trump, people are just like, let's change the subject. Or if someone mentions Biden, it's like, you know, people kind of roll their eyes and move on because people instinctively don't want that. Like the outside world gives you that all the time. You don't need that when you're playing poker. And I think that's incredibly pure. And I cherish that so much. And if poker ever lost that, if it became woke or if it became, you know, mired in a kind of like, you know, red versus blue a thing, and I don't know how this would happen, but it could, I would be so sad because it's not like that now. And I think that makes it really special.
Yeah, if it became woker, that would be terrible. No one
Is
wants
it woke now?
No one wants to play
know.
woker. It was a pun. Woker, poker, woke.
Well, that would mean it's
more woke. It also sounds like it's more woke. You know, I just meant like
like it's
woker.
woke.
The game is called woker, like poker, but woke.
Woker.
Anyway,
yeah.
That would suck. I think like there's good reasons why we don't want to talk about politics all the time. I think that's partly because politics is absolute BS. Like the actual way that people campaign for votes and the way it actually functions with the polarity and the hate and the this camp versus that camp, we're going to make you hate them so you can join us. Like it's just incredibly toxic and awful, and no one wants to deal with that when they're playing. But let me return to the idea that when we are totally stressed out in a hand, we have an uncomfortable decision, we're blinded by this like false psychopathic light that tries to get us into the van and drive us away into like a remote location to murder us, because that's what our thoughts are often doing. So like one reason why that happens, like we said, is that we are in a state of crisis, and when that's the case, we are temporarily blinkered and we see the first thing in front of us and grab at it. That's why you don't approach a drowning person directly. You want to like throw them a bit of clothing or something, right? Because they'll just grab at you if you go too close to them. They're in that frenzied state.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah, don't go right up to a drowning person.
I've been doing it wrong. The last like 4 drowning people I approached like that are all dead.
And yeah, you think you've died like 4 times then as well, because they kind of pull you under. Are you like some kind of like zombie co-host?
No, once I get too pulled in, then I back out. Then I
just manage to just like stomp them under the water and say, oh well, yeah, that didn't work, but the process was right, so it must have been bad variance that didn't work. Well, now you know it's actually been your fault. It's been your fault all along. And then the other reason,
I tell them as they drowned, I say, don't worry, I'm a stoic, I'll be fine.
And you also say, don't worry, it's the highest EV thing. Like, even though this hasn't worked, I know it's high EV, like the way we're doing this, so we don't need to revisit it at any point. The other reason it happens is that when there's a vacuum, something has to fill that vacuum, right? Like that's the way it goes. So when you have a bad poker player with very limited technical thoughts, they have an empty thought process that's usually filled with the flush draw. When there's no flush draw, you can't fill the thought process with the flush draw, right? You just can't do it. So when your thought process is that basic, and a lot of amateur poker players that are just playing recreational, it is that empty, they will grasp onto whatever they can. And it might just be that she just lost the pot and might be steaming is the sole content of the thought process, not because that thought is a big bully that's bullied away all the other good thoughts, but because there were no other good thoughts, and it's just that thought in a waiting room on its own. And then if it starts speaking, that's the only thing anyone's ever going to hear, right? You have one person in a room and they start talking, you don't hear anything else, right? That's it. So I think a lot of the time this happens because, well, with the online player that studied too much, not really had the right tuition, not had the right coach or anything like that, not had the right peers. It happens because there's too much information. It's all a jumbled soup that they can't actually access. And then with the live player that just doesn't know anything about the game, it happens because you have this like vacacious situation where there's just nothing in the brain at that point that's relevant. So we have to grab the most relevant thing that we can. And that isn't particularly relevant, but it's more relevant than the color of the felt or like what time it is. So we go with it.
What you were saying there is interesting. The online player with too much data in their head. I think I'm definitely like, that has happened to me before. And like, I spent all day on Sunday just looking at like blind versus blind spot and like basically just like what ranges are in different situations and things like that. And what the temptation is, because it's so fascinating, especially when you see certain things like, oh, like this hand is a 3-bet here, and you never would expect that kind of thing. It's like the most, like you're looking at it like this is, all of a sudden it becomes the most interesting spot in poker. Like all other spots go away and you're sucked into this spot and you're just like, this is just how what happened to me. And I learned it, I think, and I walked away thinking, okay, like I feel very confident in this situation when it comes up, and that's one spot. And then playing later that day, I literally got into that spot, and it was like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, what is it? Like all of a sudden, it was just like short circuiting. Like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
saw all these ranges, I saw all these colors. I was just like completely. I didn't shut down, and I think I ultimately played it correctly, but it was not a pleasant experience,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't smooth, and it was like it took me like way too long. They're like, why are you tanking in the small blind, like
Yep.
in a live game? Like never happens. But um yeah, I think when you're learning, this is something that has happened to me all throughout my life. Whenever I'm at a point in my life where I'm inputting a bunch of new information and I'm learning and I get very excited about the topic, I want to kind of chase every rabbit hole. I want to go down every
Mm.
path, and
Yeah.
I want to, especially if it's a path that seems really obscure,
Mm.
I want to explore it. And sometimes it's at the expense of like the broader picture. And so when you brought up that idea of like the opposite of the person who has nothing in their brain when they're facing a spot and they think, oh, well, she's steaming, I call or I jam. And the polar opposite of that is someone who has too much in their brain. I think I've been there, and I don't think it's like something that is like a huge problem, but it's definitely it's definitely a temptation, just as much as a temptation is to like take that first ride with the psychopath because you're on the side of the road
Mm.
and that's the only van that's available. um the opposite of that is, there's so many options available that you don't know which one to take, kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it depends as well, like to what extent these thoughts have been properly understood when you're learning them. So if you have 11 factors that you're looking at, blind versus blind, and you hear all of them and they kind of resonate a bit, but none of them really are processed at a deep subconscious level, like semantically, so that they can fit together and effortlessly slot together. Like if you think about how language works, for example, the fact that I'm able to speak like this right now is like an absolute fucking miracle. Like if you think about
Mm-hmm.
what's going on right now, like in our brains and our mouths and our tongues and stuff when we're speaking, and the brain is like instantly grabbing words and fusing them with other
Mm-hmm.
words because it knows the meaning of these words. Like the word fuse is so known to me that I can just grab it and instantly put it into a sentence in the right context. Like that takes such an immense amount of subconscious like neural networking going on there for you to be able to do that, right? Like if you just met that word or you were speaking like a different language that you just learned, you just wouldn't be able to do that. You'd have to slow down, you'd have to like locate the word consciously from a library of words, and it would sound totally different. And I think for the poker player that does what I just did there, like knows the meaning of, how, I don't know, sizing, how polarization affects sizing in position when you're c-betting the flop, like how relative polarization affects bet sizing. Like, it's not like an easy topic, but someone that like has really done loads of work on that and understands how it works is going to look at a flop like 10 3 deuce in a 3-bet pot and is going to be like, wow, I have a way more polarized range as a 3-better. I have all these overpairs. This is a big bet board. But they won't say like, I have all the overpairs, they don't. I'm more uncapped than they are. They'll just be like, this is a big bet board, right? Because they've like understood that so subconsciously, like why that's the case. Whereas if you take like the struggling poker tryhard who really wants to succeed at the game but just doesn't really have the right setup to do it, maybe just isn't logical enough and isn't like good enough, or maybe just doesn't have the right peer group or coach or material, whatever it may be, that person may have actually learned like 50 different concepts to the level of, oh yeah, nut advantage good for big bets, but not knowing why that actually is the case. And then if you take 50 really unformed thoughts that are just like kind of resonated a little bit, but not really, and then you try and access them and fuse them together and wield them like you're wielding words into a sentence, it just comes out as gobbledygook. And that's the way a lot of thought processes sound. When I work with a student that's been playing a long time but not very well, it's an absolute mess. Like it's an absolute fucking shit show. And I sit back and I'm like, oh my God. And as they speak, I'm like, holy fuck, this is worse than I thought.
Yeah.
And as they keep speaking, I reach a point where I'm like, I don't know if this is even savable. And that's the person that's been playing poker for like a really long time, but badly.
Yeah.
And it's much better to have just started playing poker and then like you did, and then do things right and like hire a coach and do what you did basically, than it is to like be playing for 9 years badly, because by then you're kind of fucked, to be honest. Like it's not that you're totally unsalvageable, but it's a massively uphill struggle. Massively uphill.
Yeah. I can't imagine doing what you do knowing like just the live players that I know, that how they play, how they approach the game, it feels to me like having to build, like it would be like having to like knock down a building and
Yep.
build it again or something. Like it,
Exactly.
like I mean, we're two different people, obviously, and different approaches and everything and different careers. But for me personally, it just feels so, knowing what I know, and I still have so much to learn. I know how far I've come, and I know how far so many people, or where a lot of other people are who have been playing a lot longer than me.
Mm-hmm.
And also who you combine like not having like the theoretical knowledge, but also not even having an interest in it, not even having, and granted, the students that come to you, it's just kind of a weird comparison, because the students that come to you obviously are interested in getting better, and they're willing to put in the work, and they're willing to they've hired you, right? So they're not just like, people who don't care. But I think even so, it just feels like it takes so much to undo what's been done.
Mm-hmm.
But I also look at it like that's the advantage. I mean, that's the reason to play. And I don't know, there's so much to gain against players like that. And the more I've learned about the game, the more I see how many mistakes, not only that I make, but also that other players make too, that are for the most part like unnecessary. And they make so many thought processes make the game so much harder than it already is, and force you to suffer more than you need to suffer, I think.
That's exactly.
And I just see that a lot.
Yeah, I think the concept that springs to mind there is like range advantage. Like, I wish I never even taught this concept in grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School at all.
Really?
Yeah, I kind of regret even having it in grade. I mean, it's near the end of grade 1, so it's not like I just spring it upon people right at the start, but it's the most butchered thing in the world. Like, I would say 4 out of 5 students that learn about range advantage, it makes their game way worse than better, because they take it as a causal factor. Like, there are vacuum factors in poker, right? Like, this hand has a lot of equity and therefore it will make a good value bet for this big sizing. Like, that's like a vacuum argument. You're looking at your hand against your opponent's range in a spot, defining equity, and then using your theoretical understanding of equity and bet sizing, which is an objective thing, like the periodic table of elements, by the way, not a subjective thing like your read on someone. Then you can put those together and you can use it. But with the concept like range advantage, because it isn't a vacuum causal factor, it doesn't actually cause you to know what the best play is now. People think that it is, and they use it as such. So they'll say, like, I have a big range advantage, so I'm going to bet. But like, the bet is like the wrong sizing, or people have this weird idea that like when they're betting often, they're always betting small, and when they're betting infrequently, they're always betting big, which is not always the case. And like, I think it's just, there's too much sometimes, like you say, like too many concepts is a real problem. So you're right. Like, what I do as a coach is very often just saying, okay, you just said 9 things there and only one of them is relevant, and we can use that one, and then we're almost done with the thought process. So the student will say 9 things. I'll be like, these 8 are garbage. Let's put them in the dumpster. Let's set fire to them. This one is enough to solve the spot. You said your hand is really strong and therefore you want to value bet. I think that's great. All the other shit about he might think that I am bluffing if I blah, blah, blah. This is nonsense. Like, you just said, I have a really strong hand, therefore I'm going to bet big. Great. Let's talk a little bit about why that's a good thought process. And then let's go to our equity or our estimate of it when we're value betting next time, and see, let's learn what sizes correlate with what kinds of equity and what like hand strength. Let's learn where is it urgent, where you have to value bet, and let's learn where is it only optional. And then let's build a thought process around that, and we'll toss out absolutely everything else. So yeah, when you say like you couldn't do what I do, I think the only way I can do it is that I accept that I do what I can for people. I accept that this game is really hard, and some people, many people in fact, will not really go anywhere. And that's not to say that like I expect people not to succeed. Like, I give them the benefit of the doubt that they're going to put in the work and that they're going to get better. And most people do get better, and some people get a hell of a lot better and they make a ton of progress, and coaching just transforms them utterly. But with some people, they give up because they just can't get their brain to the place where we're trying to get it, because there's too much bad stuff in there, too many hangovers from previous years of thinking. And some of the neural pathways are dug like so deep that even if we get the student thinking a bit differently, like technically, the hardest thing to treat is emotionally hardwired reactions. Like, I am obsessed with the idea that people are bullying me and bluffing me, and therefore I'm going to spew at them all the time, and I'm never going to fold when I'm in that mood. And trying to get somebody out of that trap, that's like, that's hell. Like, that is basically a place that you cannot really get someone out of without, like, sometimes therapy, like outside therapy, like actual counseling. Like, sometimes these belief systems about people picking on you or, you know, being a victim of something are so ingrained that it's like impossible to do anything quickly about it. It would take like long-term therapy in some cases, and that's what I call an obstacle in poker therapy. So when I, in my book, so when I identify that somebody has a real roadblock or obstacle, not just like a, oh, you've got the wrong thought process, let's make it right, but like you've got an ingrained, hardwired, like emotional response to something that's like really hard for you to stop. That's the kind of thing where I'm like, I can do my best, but this might just be a lost cause. There might be nothing that I have the power to actually fix here because it's that ingrained.
Have you ever had anyone come to you for coaching and you realize that they're using poker as a, I don't know, like it reveals like something else about their life, like they're using it to compensate for something, or they're, you know, they have a much bigger problem, and that you realize that really what they've come to you is not about poker at all? Like maybe it's something else.
Yes, I've done mental game coaching before that's actually spiraled into therapy, and I have to be careful about that, because when that starts to happen, like, I'm okay going into people's lives, you know, insofar as it's helpful to diagnose what their poker mental game leaks are, because like you have to do that, like very often.
Sure.
Say you have a guy who is prone to attack people, like not physically, but like through their poker strategy, like they just start like aggressing in the most obscene spots that doesn't make any sense, and throwing away tons of EV, calling in spots that are grossly under-bluffed, and just lighting money on fire because they don't want to back down. And then you learn that they grew up in New Jersey in a really rough area, and like it was all about, you know, in that sort of male culture, it was all about being tough, and you couldn't show any weakness, and you could never back down, and you were going to get eaten alive on the streets, and that was their upbringing. Well, to not use that in your coaching would be really irresponsible. To be like, well, I'm just going to ignore all the personal stuff and like approach you like you're just some generic, like, I don't know, like production of a human that came out of a factory or something. No, like all humans have their own story and their own past, and that very often weighs into their mental game issues. So you do have to get into it a bit. But when it actually becomes clear that poker is being used in a really unhealthy way, like gambling addiction is one I've had a few times, and it might not be a serious gambling like addiction yet. It might not be that they're losing their family and their job and they're spending all of their salary. It could just be that they have developed a really unhealthy attachment to the feelings that poker produces, the risk reward, the kind of thrill, the devastation of losing, that everything is amplified, and they're in a constant perpetual state of chasing losses and hoping, and everything is desire, everything is type 2 thought process, right? Everything is just they're desiring to win, and that guides everything, and that dictates all their play, and that urge is so strong based on the gambling addiction they have with poker that they cannot possibly reach a place of objectivity. So they can't sit back and see the world for what it is, because when winning every pot at all costs is your focus, you're so far dialed in and zoomed in like a desire-based way that you just can't possibly objectively analyze the world. So there's definitely been like gambling addiction cases where I've said, you are approaching a poker session in the sense that you have a real gambling problem. Like as soon as you start losing, you can't handle it and you go off a cliff, and that's a gambling addiction. When if you can't handle losing a little bit of resources in a game of chance, then you probably have a gambling problem, because a gambling problem is both being extremely sensitive to the bad feelings of losing and the good feelings of winning. Like generally people I've known that have gambling addictions, you have this image of like the gambler being this guy that like doesn't care if he loses and is like reckless. That's not actually a gambler. That's not someone that, usually that's not someone with a big gambling problem. In my experience, that's just a really reckless person that doesn't care about money. But when you get someone that has a real gambling problem, and I've known various people in my life who have had one, they really care about the resources. They care so much about the resources that they have to in order to have that level of addiction. So when they're winning, it feels way too good. It feels like far too good. It's like unhealthy amount of endorphins. And when they're losing, it feels way too bad. Like a real problem gambler will feel awful when they're
So
losing.
interesting.
They'll feel
Yeah,
awful. And I've definitely come
that's
across poker
so
players that
interesting.
care way too much about winning and losing,
Yeah,
and that's the big problem. Yeah.
that's fascinating. That really is fascinating because I've up, you know, up until just right now, I've always had the image of like the gambling addiction being like the guy who's like, you know, has a family at home and takes, you know, the his entire salary to the casino and like doesn't have money for groceries and doesn't have money for just basic stuff. But it's so interesting that it's more that you feel it more intensely than other people, which is, I guess, maybe similar to other addictions.
Yep.
But I guess other addictions are maybe a little bit like alcohol and drugs is like chemical, but
Mm-hmm.
this is like an organic experience that happens. Like you're not ingesting anything, you're just experiencing something that gives you an extreme high and extreme
Yeah, it's
low.
still chemicals and
And
drugs though. It's just natural ones that the body
it's just
produces
natural, right?
rather than the, you know, outside substances. So like when you are playing a poker session and you're someone that actually has a gambling problem, when you're up like 2 or 3 buy-ins, you're not just like, oh yeah, this is nice, I'm having a winning day. You're like on some kind of actual dopamine high. Like you're feeling like
Mm,
really, really good, but also really fearful that you might lose it or whatever. And then as soon as you like go on a downswing, it's desperation. It's not just like, oh, I'm reckless, I'm gonna, oh, I don't care, let's play another $100. Like that's me when I'm like on a night out at the casino, like, oh, 100 quid here on my blackjack box.
yeah,
That's just not caring. That's like trying to like have a bit of fun or whatever and being a reckless idiot, like, and being a drunk reckless idiot, right? I used to do that a lot,
mm,
but that's different to, oh my god, this is now my whole universe, and if I don't
yeah,
win right now, this is going to be really terrible. Thank god I won. Let's just go one more time. Like that's a real problem, like
yeah,
problem gambler right
yeah,
there. And I saw a lot of it because I used to be a croupier before I was
mm,
in poker. Seriously, I would deal in casinos and stuff like that. Like I dealt roulette, I dealt blackjack, and you would see a big difference between the people who came in that just wanted to like have a nice time, and if they lost they were disappointed. A problem gambler doesn't get disappointed. That's not an emotion that they get at all. They get completely either outraged or depressed or traumatized or whatever you want to say, but they're not
yeah,
disappointed. If you can be disappointed about something happening, then you only care to such an extent about that thing, right? Like imagine the things that disappoint you. That's why disappointment is a really healthy emotion for a poker player, because it's like, oh,
mm,
I lost 4 buy-ins today. I'm a bit disappointed about that. That's amazing. If you're disappointed that you lost 4 buy-ins, then you've reacted in a really healthy way where like clearly you got a bad outcome and you shouldn't be happy about it. So disappointment is the logical place to go to.
yeah,
But you're not moving up stakes and risking the rest of your bankroll in a desperate attempt to
right,
claw it back. And nor are you like quitting the game and cashing out to protect yourself from the immense hurt. What problem gamblers do as poker players is they take hiatuses all the time because they can't
yeah,
handle all the hurt of losing, or they move up in stakes to chase the losses, or when they win, they cash out and move down in stakes. It's all about self-preservation and self-protection and the emotions that need to be of a certain
yeah,
level before they're protecting against that. So to like bring this back to like your original question, if I meet up with a student these days and right off the bat I can tell that they're like extremely charged by winning and losing to the point where it defines their day or their week or something like that, or like their whole life choices are like from that point on, I'm not really comfortable working with that person, because even if I make them good at poker, I'm actually just helping them gamble. I'm helping them doing something that ultimately is going to destroy them because of the way they're wired with respect to that thing.
yeah,
And not everybody who likes poker and is passionate about poker is actually wired to play poker. There are people who are wired in such a way that the last thing they should do is play a game like poker, even though they love
yeah,
it intellectually. So the saddest case is like someone who loves poker intellectually, but when they're at the table, it's like a rabid animal that takes over, and they're now like
yeah,
so occupied by these desires and emotions that they can't use all this stuff they've built up. They've got this inventory of skills that they've built up through poker education, and
yeah,
they can't access a single thing from that shelf of skills because they are temporarily that kind of blinded, emotionally led animal for that amount.
mm,
And that's going to happen every time they play. They're never going to get to a point where, you know, that if they do have a true gambling issue, that they're using poker to, you know, they're using poker as the means of that, then
yeah,
that can't really help them ever, right? And the easiest thing to
yeah,
do is to say this is not going to work. So it does happen.
yeah,
Yeah, it does.
yeah. Interesting. That's interesting. Um, so this is a change of subject,
Yeah.
but um, the manager of the card room that I play in normally randomly came up to me the other day and was like, "We should play Heads Up. I want to play you Heads Up." And I was like, "All right, so I think I'm going to play him Heads Up."
Let's do it. Let's go.
Yeah,
Come on.
I know. I've never played Heads Up before. I mean, just one tournament that I kind of like I played Heads Up at the final table, but yeah, I'm excited. I texted him yesterday and we're gonna kind of set a date and time, hopefully pretty soon, and some stakes. But what's funny about it is that he plays Hold'em. He plays like at the card room, they have like a lot of mixed games, and he mainly plays in the mixed games. And the mixed games are a lot bigger than Hold'em. And but he plays Hold'em every once in a while, and we've gotten into pots and stuff. And he says to me after he challenged me, he goes, "The difference between you and me is that I don't care about money."
Yeah, and that's actually a helpful trait to have for some people, because
Yeah.
people who live their life not caring about money, they're not going to obsess over like expenditure like some other
Yeah.
people are. Like, I don't really care about money in the sense that I care about how much I ultimately have. I care about how much is
Yeah.
in my nest egg. I care about like what I retire with, and I care about like my business doing well overall, but I don't care about individual transactions at all. So like if you said to me, "Oh, Pete, your website will be a bit faster if you invest X money," I'm not going to sit there and agonize over that. I'm like, good, like take the money. Like let's throw money at things until they work better and until they generate more money. And I think that's the secret to like being good at business. And that's a real asset. So this guy, that's probably a trait that stands him in good stead in a lot of areas of life. Whereas the gambling addict actually cares so much about resource tokens and money that they cannot resist the brain's fixation with those numbers going up and down in short spaces of time. It's the opposite of someone who's good at business. The gambling addict is the opposite of the businessman when it comes to the attitude to individual transactions of risk and reward.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because he plays pretty big, and like, and a lot of people mistakenly think that he just likes to gamble a lot, and I think he does, but I also feel like it's true that he grew up in Serbia, and he has like a totally different background than me, and I think I don't know, I really like him, and he's like a really interesting person, but I don't know what brought it on. He just like challenged me, and I was like, sure. And so so we're still working on the details, but I'll keep you posted.
I think we should have a little segment like when this match starts. We should have like Melissa's heads up battle segment, like it's the Poke Negreanu or like Nick Airball against Barkey, like it's one of these high profile matches. And is there like a tap out like level where like you're allowed to quit after a certain amount of loss? Like is there a certain amount is there a side bet on who wins the match?
We floated that you could tap out at 5K.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. I don't know if it wasn't like we agreed upon that. We're still very early on working on the details. I texted him yesterday, and he was like, "Yeah, the club's getting a bunch of new chairs, and that's occupying a lot of my time right now." He just ordered a bunch of new chairs for the room.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm ready whenever you are, and let's just like figure out the details. And he was like, "Oh, we're definitely going to play." And I think we will for sure. Like I'm 100% convinced that he is not going to like back down. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm excited.
Gonna be awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. What are you gonna do to work on your heads up game then?
I'm gonna look at a lot of charts, and I'm gonna
do some sims, like do some pile sims or whatever, and just like look at like the basic spots, like just get a really good feel for what sizes will I use on these kind of textures, what will I use on this texture, what will my raising range look like, and get the theory down first, right? Before you even like get anything into the, oh, he's got this tendency and he's got that tendency. Just always, I mean, you know this already. I've already like coached you, so you already do this, but always compare it to what he should do. So when you say, "Oh, I've noticed he does X," be like, "Well, he should do Y. What's the difference between X and Y?" I think that's a great way to go. But look at all of the turn C bet, like all of the facing turn C bet, facing turn, probe, facing flop, stab, just all the super common nodes on the first couple of post-flop streets. I would start with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to have, this probably won't be happening for at least a couple of weeks. So I'm going to have time to study, and I'm definitely going to, divert my time, my study time to this, because I think it'll be really interesting, and I think it'll be fun. And he's kind of a difficult player to play against, because and again, I think it has to do with his background. He is truly stoic. When I mean that, in the sense of like, he doesn't give off a lot of emotion, and I've seen him lose enormous pots and just rebuy, and like it doesn't even affect him at all. And I think a lot of it has to do with his background.
Yeah,
I think he just grew up harder than anyone else. Like all of us, like spoiled Americans, and I think that like he just looks at us all as like kind of like pretty weak people. But it'll be interesting, and yeah, so I'll keep everyone posted. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. This is juicy.
Yeah.
I love a good heads up battle, so make some content out of it, make some hand histories, see what happens. Yeah, sounds good.
For sure.
All right, let's do some YouTube comments, and then we'll see. Do you have any stories battling the more irritating side of the pool this week?
I have an interesting, it's less irritating than interesting. It was a player that is kind of, he comes in like once a week at the card room I play at, and he's like the true definition of a recreational player. He is always drinking and kind of there to have a good time, but what has always annoyed me is that he's also like no action whatsoever, and he has like a negative VPIP. And so the other day I happened to be sitting next to him at the table, and he looked at me and he said, he goes, "I get the impression you don't like me very much at all." And I said, "No, that's not true. I don't have any opinion whatsoever." I said, "I just, you don't play a lot of pots." So I said, "I don't really have, I was like, basically, I'm not really sure how to relate to you." And he was just like, "Okay, well, that's fair. I just thought that you hated me." And I was like, "No, it's nothing personal, whatever." And then like a couple of hands later, we got into a pot together, and like I 3-bet him, and he called, and he flat, and it flatted, and it was like a queen high flop, and he donked 2 streets, and I ended up folding, and he shows like a total bluff. And I was like, okay, I really felt nothing at the time. I was like, that's interesting, because I was acting with the best information I had at the time.
Yep.
But anyways, it was an interesting exchange that led to an interesting move action on his part. Like he still doesn't play any hands, but
yeah, clearly this person like kind of cares what you think for whatever reason. So like on the one hand, he's worried about like whether you like him or not, and then when you express that like he's a bit tight and like he's maybe not the most like action sort of player, he then like becomes more action. It's almost like he's trying to please you. He's like trying to behave in a way that like obviously you were the victim, quote unquote, of the bluff, like we talked about. But it feels it feels like he's trying to like he's looking up to you. I mean, a lot of people seem to look up to you in that card room, Melissa, right? They seem to like see you as one of the more I don't know, like solid pros or players, semi pros or whatever.
I think so. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I don't know. We just think of it that way, but yeah, I mean, maybe that's the case. Yeah, I don't know, but I also feel like but then he was telling me about how he has a son and he's like a single parent, and then I was like, oh, like I really was like interested in what he was saying, and I actually now feel like a little bad. I definitely am like I'm like very competitive, and I get I just treat people as obstacles a lot of times in the way of like getting what I want, which is just winning. And so I think every once in a while I'm reminded of that. And I don't think it changes my behavior. Like it'll never change me. It's who I am. But
I'll always treat people as means to my own ends, even when they're nice.
I'm a psychopath. No, I just feel like you have to have that attitude to
in poker,
be successful.
If you're going to maximize EV, yes, absolutely.
I don't treat people as means to an end.
I know, I'm kidding.
But I do look at it like I'm not here to fuck around.
Yeah. No, you're not here to like give up EV in order that you please people or anything like that. Like you're there to do your job, which is to maximize that EV. Okay, cool.
All right.
This video, the last video I put out, we have a lot of comments. I figured the Poker Distilled podcast is an okay way to reply to some of them, just because I don't get the chance to really reply to comments. So even if it's not Pete versus Troll, there might be some stuff in here.
So what video is this?
So this is the biggest difference between pro poker players and amateurs that came out
Nice.
last week, which has been a really successful video, actually. People really liked this one. It was kind of quick fire hand review, which tends to go down quite well. People like that. And it was very much like about not just how people think about hands, but like why people aren't at professional level. And the answer to this, by the way, is that they fall apart too much when things are going badly. Like, in my opinion, the biggest difference between a pro and an amateur, apart from like the obvious skill gap, is just that when the pro is running bad, you know, like your Serbian friend, they're able to reload and keep going and move on to the next spot and still play something resembling their A game, even if it's not like, you know, a pro's game will go from A to B when they're running bad, but an amateur's game might go from A to Z, and that was kind of the point that I made in this video. So I'll reply to a couple of comments here. In the first hand, we flop trip aces, and we have ace 10 on a board of ace 7 two-tone, and it's checked to us. We are button versus big blind, something like that, and we c-bet the flop. We bet the turn, we bet the river, and we fold to a jam on the river, so we sort of triple barrel this innocuous-ish looking board. The board is like ace 7 deuce 9, no draws complete, we bet fold the river. Which is something you should definitely do in spots that are basically unbluffed like this. When fish raise your river triple, it's bad news. But someone says, I actually wouldn't bet with the ace 10 with flop trips. You are generating too many folds from trash most of the time. Now, if this were true, it would mean that solvers and conventional wisdom were all completely wrong about how to play the flop. And this is an example of a blinkers on thought process where the poster is only thinking about the times the villain has trash. And it is true that trash, like total trash, folds the flop, although like king highs and backdoor draw Broadway hands won't, and like obviously there's pocket pairs and 7x and worse ace x2 that's calling. But what you can't do is just focus on one category of hand and saying because we don't want that to fold we shouldn't bet. That's an insufficient piece of logic. It's a thought process where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. So I can say the premise is true, that there are plenty of trash combos and they do fold when I bet, but it's false to say that that means that therefore it's a check. Yep. Anything to add on that kind of point?
Yeah, I think that's a huge, so many players have that attitude, or like we'll say that like you know, you're only getting worse to fold or something like that, or you're getting better to call, worse to fold or something. Forget how it goes, but yeah, that's so typical. I loved that video and I loved that first hand because I've encountered that exact spot. God, it was so strange. I encountered it like 3 sessions in a row where I got raised on the river on a board that was, you know, heavily favorable to me, where it was just like fortune reversal kind of thing. And it's such an underbluffed spot. It's so underbluffed. And yeah, and I just thought it was great that you included it in your hand. I think we had a hand on the Discord, a couple, like maybe like last week, where you know, someone brought it to one of the coaches on there that they had gotten to kind of a fortune reversal spot. And I think in this spot they ended up calling, but the discussion was so interesting because those spots are so underbluffed that it becomes this kind of analysis of like, what is pool doing here? And if it's underbluffed, you know, having exhausted all the other pieces of evidence in our toolkit, you know, because it's underbluff, you know, we fold, or maybe we find the call and we catch that 1% of the pool that bluffs here. And I just relate to it because I just happened to encounter those situations twice in big pots, and I fold it all the time. I mean every single time I fold.
That's great. I think a really powerful thought in those situations as well. The people who do bluff there, like maybe they're over bluffing, or maybe they're bluffing at the correct frequency, or who knows, maybe some of them are under bluffing. But what about the people who just don't own a bluff button in that spot? Like cognitively, they just do not possess a button that makes them go all in over a triple barrel with a bluff. Like it's just not in their toolkit. That's barely in my toolkit. Like I have to think really hard to ever find spots to want to do that. For a lot of people that I teach, it's just non-existent. And for a lot of recreational players, it's non-existent. So the next time you face that, if you start with the premise that 80% of your pool don't possess that button, The most equity you could possibly have is 20%, even if the people who do bluff only have bluffs and never have value, which is also false. So you can kind of reduce this to a spot where you have to fold if the original premise that most people don't possess a bluff button in that spot is true. And then you can contrast that to a spot that's like, well, you just check twice to the fish and they bet on the end. It's like, yeah, most people have a bluff button there, right? So the same argument can't be used. But when people 3-bet the turn, raise your river bet, raise your triple barrel, attack you after you've polarized heavily, 3-bet the flop, this kind of thing. 5-bet pre-flop. They just don't own bluffs in that spot. Their range doesn't have any a lot of the time, and therefore you don't need to worry about it. If you run into like the one person who does bluff there, then fine, like you deal with that,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, it's there's a great line in the CPS, I think it's in grade 2, where you talk about how the things that hurt you in poker are the things that happen a lot, not the things that happen every once in a while, you know.
Exactly.
Or
It's your constant mistakes.
yeah, the constant mistakes. And so yeah, I was in a 5-5 game where I got into that spot where I ended up folding a jack high flush on the river.
Love it. Jack high flushes suck. Like they're only like, if somebody raises you when you have a jack high flush, you should probably fold in like almost any late street situation where that happens. Like, okay, that's a blanket statement, but there's nothing worse than a jack high flush for bet calling with on the river. Like if you frequently bet call jack high flushes on the river, you're doing a lot of stuff wrong, I would say. That's a good poker rule.
You don't deserve to play.
You don't deserve to play the game. Full screenshot. Yep.
All right. Did you have more?
I was trying to find a nasty one, but
your phone.
Yeah, no, I'm just bored by you, so I just do this sometimes. I'm kidding.
Sometimes it's good to read a comment that's just not like terrible, that actually has like that you can respond and we can talk about in a way that's like not just you like
venting
being like like actually has like something fruitful about it. So I don't think that I would put that comment as like that's not like a trollish comment. That's just like the comment to me last week was like actually like a great response.
To be honest, like most of the comments are just lovely and it's people just saying like we love the content and all of that. So I don't want to read them out because they're just like inflating my ego. I already read them on my own and it inflates my ego enough. But here's one. Just lost 23 buy-ins on 200 NL in a couple of days, and I was running very bad, but lost some stacks just because I was on tilt. By the way, Pete, what stakes are you playing? I've only seen you play 100 NL on stars. That's weird because like all of my stars volume is 200 apart from like a couple of sessions where it wasn't running. Losing 23 buy-ins in a couple of days, that actually happens a lot online. Like it's not that uncommon. What I would avoid doing is putting in high volume without breaks when you are playing and running badly, because if you're four tabling Zoom for 4 hours straight, you're putting in a hell of a lot of volume, like back to back, and your game can fall off a cliff, but your ability to monitor your own level of play can fall off of a cliff at just the same rate. So you could end up thinking you're only playing your B game. Oh, I wasn't playing great, but I wasn't playing terrible. And then when your A game self sees that, it actually looks like F game. So you have to give yourself space when you're running bad. You know, if you're down 8 buy-ins a day, you should probably just stop playing for that day, unless you're in like the top 1 or 2% of people's mental game for tolerating that kind of thing. Because for most people, being down 8 buy-ins in a day is enough to make them play significantly worse and also be significantly less aware of how well or badly they're playing. So give yourself space.
Yeah. That's always hard too, because it's like we were talking about before, like you don't want to be like, I'm so emotionally affected by this, I have to disengage, I have to recover, because we don't want to teach our brain this kind of,
we don't want to take a big hiatus every time it happens, and we don't want to like stop a session every time we're down. But there are limits. Like when we're having like one of the worst 3% of days that we can have, that's such an outlier that probably our brain isn't equipped to handle that. We're not really versed in handling the most extreme scenarios in life or in poker like we are the more common spread at the middle of the graph. I saw this meme the other day that kind of cracked me up, and the one where you have like the try hard nerdy guy in the middle, like the medium IQ guy, and then you have like the sort of superhuman alien looking guy in the hoodie at the right who's like the IQ 200 or whatever, and then you have like the sort of imbecile that only has like half a face like on the left hand side with like a little tiny bit of hair and like a sort of gormless expression. So it was like that, and it was like the guy on the left was like good hand bet, and the guy in the middle is like, range advantage, and blah, blah, and then the guy on the right's like, good hand bet. And it's just so fucking true in poker that, like, when you have a good value hand, in almost all cases, you should either be betting on a later street, let's say, you should either be betting big or you should be check raising big, and you should be putting tons of money in the pot. But it's the people in the middle that are like, oh, what's he going to call? Like, oh no, like, I better like deceive my. It's like so true in poker that beginners do so many things better than like studied, try hard players with a messy thought process.
God. So true. This is the example with that I was just talking about with that recreational player who got me to fold in that pot, where the line he took, I mean, he was out of position, he was donk betting and everything, but it was just like a very strong line. And like for what he had, like I had ace jack, he had king jack, and like for what he had, like it was probably, I don't know, I didn't look at it too closely, but but it worked. And it was like in my thinking, it was like, okay, like he's, hasn't played a lot of pot, he's just strong, but also there's a queen on the board, I don't have a queen, it's all low cards. I'm not going to call him 3 streets down with ace high, and it's like this, the way the line he took just worked in that spot. And, if that was someone who was, I think, more advanced, they probably wouldn't have played it that way.
Yeah. And like that may or may not mean that it was a good play, but sometimes like a beginner will be uninhibited because they'll have a thought like, well, she thinks I'm strong.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
I'm going to bluff because she probably thinks I'm not bluffing. Therefore, like she's going to fold a lot. And that's actually a good exploitative thought. Like if that's right, then you probably do have conclusion following like relatively closely from premise that like fold equity has gone up because of the read of this player. And then that's great. Whereas when you get like the person with the dangerous level of knowledge, right? They know enough to be dangerous to themselves, let's say. It becomes more like, yes, but to the blockers, and they're like quibbling over some 1% swing, when in reality, all that actually mattered was, well, she thought you were in net and she was folding most of her range, so you should have bluffed.
Yes.
And then the good player is just like, oh, well, this is obvious, I'm going to bluff because of what the good player knows that's the most primary factor, just like the bad player kind of did. Yeah.
Well, that's why when he showed me the bluff, like I felt nothing. It was like, I didn't feel like I was like angry. I didn't get annoyed. I didn't get any kind of tilt. I felt nothing because I was like, I reacted with all the information that was available to me. And I think I made the most rational, Yeah.
And if you make that reaction like 100 times, it'll probably be the right reaction like 80 times. It's just like, this is one of the minority times where it's not. Right. Let's wrap up there. I'm going to have to shoot.
Okay.
But this has been a fun episode.
I can't tell what time it is or how long we've gone because your screen, it says 16:02 and I don't know what that means.
You need to learn how time, you need to learn to tell the time, like how time works.
That's not time. That's numbers that are, I don't know, it's meaningless.
16 is obviously 4, Melissa. Obviously 16 means 4, right?
Half of that is the time it is where I live.
Yeah, half of 16, yeah. That won't always be true. Because when it's 18 here, it'll be, what will it be for you? 10? And that's not half.
That's weird. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh no, you're 8 hours. Are you 8 hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're 8 hours.
So it would be, yeah.
Yeah. So when it's 18, it'll be 10, right?
No, it'll be 9, right?
Yeah. It's still not
17. No, it'll be 10. You're right.
So it's not always. You can't use that. Like, it was half once. Broken clock's right twice a day.
See, I wanted to take the shortcut. I just looked at it and I was like, range advantage, bet small.
Range advantage, bet the middle of my range, like an absolute moron.
Pot. Yeah, I have pocket sevens.
Bet. No, sometimes they bet it for pot. They like sevens on like queen 10 deuce, small blind versus big blind, and I'll like pot it, and I'll be like, "What are you doing?" And I'll be like, "Range advantage." And I'll be like, "Yeah, we're gonna have a problem here." Yeah, we're gonna have a problem here. It was like the start of the Eminem song.
I can't coach you. You have a problem.
Just like you are beyond help. You just potted sevens on queen 10 deuce because of range advantage. Get the fuck out of my classroom and
no refunds.
Go play a different game. No refunds, as it says in the T's and C's on carrotcorner.com for coaching. Do check out carrotcorner.com. Grady is coming soon. We have the CPS, the Carrot Poker School. We have cash injection. We have loads of courses by me, and we have bunch of cool.
We have an entire back
drawings.
catalog of Poker Distilled. I mean, we're building a back catalog. So if you have a lot of podcast time, you can go back.
You're going on a massive road trip. Go back and listen to all of our older content. Okay, let's do the freeform thing next week as well. Because like this is good. I like just going with it and seeing what comes up and then naming it after. All right, guys, we'll see you next time on Poker Distilled. Bye for now.